Part 2. A structural analysis. The following structural scheme, abstracted from the data on the states of non-ordinary reality presented in the foregoing part of this work, is conceived as an attempt to disclose the internal cohesion and the cogency of Don Juan's teachings. The structure, as I assess it, is composed of four concepts which are the main units. 1. Man of knowledge. 2. A man of knowledge had an ally. 3. An ally had a rule. And 4. The rule was corroborated by special consensus. These four units are in turn composed of a number of subsidiary ideas, thus the total structure comprises all the meaningful concepts that were presented until the time I discontinued the apprenticeship. In a sense, these units represent successive levels of analysis, each level modifying the preceding one. Because this conceptual structure is completely dependent on the meaning of all its units, the following clarification seems to be pertinent at this point. Throughout this entire work, meaning has been rendered as I understood it. The component concepts of Don Juan's knowledge as I have presented them here could not be the exact duplicate of what he said himself. In spite of all the effort I have put forth to render these concepts as faithfully as possible, their meaning has been deflected by my own attempts to classify them. The arrangement of the four main units of this structural scheme is, however, a logical sequence which appears to be free from the influence of extraneous classificatory devices of my own. But, insofar as the component ideas of each main unit are concerned, it has been impossible to discard my personal influence. At certain points extraneous classificatory items are necessary in order to render the phenomena understandable. And, if such a task was to be accomplished here, it had to be done by zigzagging back and forth from the alleged meanings and classificatory scheme of the teacher to the meanings and classificatory devices of the apprentice. The operative order. The first unit. Man of knowledge. At a very early stage of my apprenticeship, Don Juan made the statement that the goal of his teachings was to show how to become a man of knowledge. I use that statement as a point of departure. It is obvious that to become a man of knowledge was an operational goal. And it is also obvious that every part of Don Juan's orderly teachings was geared to fulfill that goal in one way or another. My line of reasoning here is that under the circumstances man of knowledge, being an operational goal, must have been indispensable to explaining some operative order. Then, it is justifiable to conclude that, in order to understand that operative order, one has to understand its objective, man of knowledge. After having established man of knowledge as the first structural unit, it was possible for me to arrange with assurance the following 7 concepts as its proper components. 1. To become a man of knowledge was a matter of learning. 2. A man of knowledge had unbending intent. 3. A man of knowledge had clarity of mind. 4. To become a man of knowledge was a matter of strenuous labor. 5. A man of knowledge was a warrior. 6. To become a man of knowledge was an unceasing process. And 7. A man of knowledge had an ally. These 7 concepts were themes. They ran through the teachings, determining the character of Don Juan's entire knowledge. Inasmuch as the operational goal of his teachings was to produce a man of knowledge, everything he taught was imbued with the specific characteristics of each of the 7 themes. Together they construed the concept man of knowledge as a way of conducting oneself, a way of behaving that was the end result of a long and hazardous training. Man of knowledge, however, was not a guide to behavior, but a set of principles encompassing all the unordinary circumstances pertinent to the knowledge being taught. Each one of the 7 themes was composed, in turn, of various other concepts, which covered their different facets. From Don Juan's statements it was possible to assume that a man of knowledge could be a diabolero, that is, a black sorcerer. He stated that his teacher was a diabolero and so was he in the past, although he had ceased to be concerned with certain aspects of the practice of sorcery. Since the goal of his teaching was to show how to become a man of knowledge, and since his knowledge consisted of being a diabolero, there may have been an inherent connection between man of knowledge and diabolero. Although Don Juan never used the two terms interchangeably, the likelihood that they were connected raised the possibility that man of knowledge with its 7 themes and their component concepts covered, theoretically, all the circumstances that might have arisen in the course of becoming a Diabolero. To become a man of knowledge was a matter of learning. The first theme made it implicit that learning was the only possible way of becoming a man of knowledge, and that in turn implied the act of making a resolute effort to achieve an end. To become a man of knowledge was the end result of a process, as opposed to an immediate acquisition through an act of grace or through bestowal by supernatural powers. The plausibility of learning how to become a man of knowledge warranted the existence of a system for teaching one how to accomplish it. The first theme had 3 components. 1. There were no overt requirements for becoming a man of knowledge. 2. There were some covert requirements. 3. The decision as to who could learn to become a man of knowledge was made by an impersonal power. Apparently there were no overt prerequisites that would have determined who was, or who was not, qualified to learn how to become a man of knowledge. Ideally, the task was open to anybody who wished to pursue it. Yet, in practice, such a stand was inconsistent with the fact that Don Juan as a teacher selected his apprentices. In fact, any teacher under the circumstances would have selected his apprentices by means of matching them against some covert prerequisites. The specific nature of these prerequisites was never formalized. Don Juan only insinuated that there were certain clues one had to bear in mind when viewing a prospective apprentice. The clues he alluded to were supposed to reveal whether or not the candidate had a certain disposition of character, which Don Juan called unbending intent. Nevertheless, the final decision in matters of who could learn to become a man of knowledge was left to an impersonal power that was known to Don Juan, but was outside his sphere of volition. The impersonal power was credited with pointing out the right person by allowing him to perform a deed of extraordinary nature, or by creating a set of peculiar circumstances around that person. Hence, there was never a conflict between the absence of overt prerequisites and the existence of undisclosed, covert prerequisites. The man who was singled out in that manner became the apprentice. Don Juan called him the escogido, the one who was chosen. But to be an escogido meant more than to be a mere apprentice. An escogido, by the sheer act of being selected by a power, was considered already to be different from ordinary men. He was considered already to be the recipient of a minimum amount of power which was supposed to be augmented by learning. But learning was a process of unending quest, and the power that made the original decision, or a similar power, was expected to make similar decisions on the issue of whether an escogido could continue learning or whether he had been defeated. Those decisions were manifested through omens that occurred at any point of the teachings. In that respect, any peculiar circumstances surrounding an apprentice were considered to be such omens. A man of knowledge had unbending intent. The idea that a man of knowledge needed unbending intent referred to the exercise of volition. Having unbending intent meant having the will to execute a necessary procedure by maintaining oneself at all times rigidly within the boundaries of the knowledge being taught. A man of knowledge needed a rigid will in order to endure the obligatory quality that every act possessed when it was performed in the context of his knowledge. The obligatory quality of all the acts performed in such a context, and their being inflexible and predetermined, were no doubt unpleasant to any man, for which reason a modicum of unbending intent was sought as the only covert requirement needed by a prospective apprentice. Unbending intent was composed of 1. Frugality, 2. Soundness of judgment, and 3. Lack of freedom to innovate. A man of knowledge needed frugality because the majority of the obligatory acts dealt with instances or with elements that were either outside the boundaries of ordinary everyday life, or were not customary in ordinary activity, and the man who had to act in accordance with them needed an extraordinary effort every time he took action. It was implicit that one could have been capable of such an extraordinary effort only by being frugal with any other activity that did not deal directly with such predetermined actions. Since all acts were predetermined and obligatory, A man of knowledge needed soundness of judgment. This concept did not imply common sense, but did imply the capacity to assess the circumstances surrounding any need to act. A guide for such an assessment was provided by bringing together, as rationales, all the parts of the teachings which were at one's command at the given moment in which any action had to be carried out. Thus, the guide was always changing as more parts were learned, yet it always implied the conviction that any obligatory act one may have had to perform was, in fact, the most appropriate under the circumstances. Because all acts were pre-established and compulsory, having to carry them out meant lack of freedom to innovate. Don Juan's system of imparting knowledge was so well established that there was no possibility of altering it in any way. A man of knowledge had clarity of mind. Clarity of mind was the theme that provided a sense of direction. The fact that all acts were predetermined meant that one's orientation within the knowledge being taught was equally predetermined. As a consequence, clarity of mind supplied only a sense of direction. It reaffirmed continuously the validity of the course being taken through the component ideas of 1. Freedom to seek a path, 2. Knowledge of the specific purpose, and 3. Being fluid. It was believed that one had freedom to seek a path. Having the freedom to choose was not incongruous with the lack of freedom to innovate. These two ideas were not in opposition nor did they interfere with each other. Freedom to seek a path referred to the liberty to choose among different possibilities of action which were equally effective and usable. The criterion for choosing was the advantage of one possibility over others, based on one's preference. As a matter of fact, the freedom to choose a path imparted a sense of direction through the expression of personal inclinations. Another way to create a sense of direction was through the idea that there was a specific purpose for every action performed in the context of the knowledge being taught. Therefore, a man of knowledge needed clarity of mind in order to match his own specific reasons for acting with the specific purpose of every action. The knowledge of the specific purpose of every action was the guide he used to judge the circumstances surrounding any need to act. Another facet of clarity of mind was the idea that a man of knowledge, in order to reinforce the performance of his obligatory actions, needed to assemble all the resources that the teachings had placed at his command. This was the idea of being fluid. It created a sense of direction by giving one the feeling of being malleable and resourceful. The compulsory quality of all acts would have imbued one with a sense of stiffness or sterility had it not been for the idea that a man of knowledge needed to be fluid. To become a man of knowledge was a matter of strenuous labor. A man of knowledge had to possess or had to develop in the course of his training an all-around capacity for exertion. Don Juan stated that to become a man of knowledge was a matter of strenuous labor. Strenuous labor denoted a capacity, 1. To put forth dramatic exertion, 2. To achieve efficacy, and 3. To meet challenge. In the path of a man of knowledge, drama was undoubtedly the outstanding single issue, and a special type of exertion was needed for responding to circumstances that required dramatic exploitation, that is to say, a man of knowledge needed dramatic exertion. Taking Don Juan's behavior as an example, at first glance it may have seemed that his dramatic exertion was only his own idiosyncratic preference for histrionics. Yet his dramatic exertion was always much more than acting, it was rather a profound state of belief. He imparted through dramatic exertion the peculiar quality of finality to all the acts he performed. As a consequence, then, his acts were set on a stage in which death was one of the main protagonists. It was implicit that death was a real possibility in the course of learning because of the inherently dangerous nature of the items with which a man of knowledge dealt. Then, it was logical that the dramatic exertion created by the conviction that death was a ubiquitous player was more than histrionics. Exertion entailed not only drama, but also the need of efficacy. Exertion had to be effective, it had to possess the quality of being properly channeled, of being suitable. The idea of impending death created not only the drama needed for overall emphasis, but also the conviction that every action involved a struggle for survival, the conviction that annihilation would result if one's exertion did not meet the requirement of being efficacious. Exertion also entailed the idea of challenge, that is, the act of testing whether, and proving that, one was capable of performing a proper act within the rigorous boundaries of the knowledge being taught. A man of knowledge was a warrior. The existence of a man of knowledge was an unceasing struggle, and the idea that he was a warrior, leading a warrior's life, provided one with the means for achieving emotional stability. The idea of a man at war encompassed four concepts. 1. A man of knowledge had to have respect. 2. He had to have fear. 3. He had to be wide awake. 4. He had to be self-confident. Hence, to be a warrior was a form of self-discipline which emphasized individual accomplishment, yet it was a stand in which personal interests were reduced to a minimum, as in most instances personal interest was incompatible with the rigor needed to perform any predetermined, obligatory act. A man of knowledge in his role of warrior was obligated to have an attitude of deferential regard for the items with which he dealt. He had to imbue everything related to his knowledge with profound respect in order to place everything in a meaningful perspective. Having respect was equivalent to having assessed one's insignificant resources when facing the unknown. If one remained in that frame of thought, the idea of respect was logically extended to include oneself, for one was as unknown as the unknown itself. The exercise of so sobering a feeling of respect transformed the apprenticeship of this specific knowledge, which may otherwise have appeared to be absurd, into a very rational alternative. Another necessity of a warrior's life was the need to experience and carefully to evaluate the sensation of fear. The ideal was that, in spite of fear, one had to proceed with the course of one's acts. Fear was supposed to be conquered, and there was an alleged time in the life of a man of knowledge when it was vanquished, but first one had to be conscious of being afraid and duly to evaluate that sensation. Don Juan asserted that one was capable of conquering fear only by facing it. As a warrior, a man of knowledge also needed to be wide awake. A man at war had to be on the alert in order to be cognizant of most of the factors pertinent to the two mandatory aspects of awareness: 1. Awareness of intent, and 2. Awareness of the expected flux. Awareness of intent was the act of being cognizant of the factors involved in the relationship between the specific purpose of any obligatory act and one's own specific purpose for acting. Since all of the obligatory acts had a definite purpose, a man of knowledge had to be wide awake, that is, he needed to be capable at all times of matching the definite purpose of every obligatory act with the definite reason that he had in mind for desiring to act. A man of knowledge, by being aware of that relationship, was also capable of being cognizant of what was believed to be the expected flux. What I have called here the awareness of the expected flux referred to the certainty that one was capable of detecting at all times the important variables involved in the relationship between the specific purpose of every act and one's specific reason for acting. By being aware of the expected flux, one was supposed to detect the most subtle changes. That deliberate awareness of changes accounted for the recognition and interpretation of omens and of other unordinary events. The last aspect of the idea of a warrior's behavior was the need for self-confidence, that is, the assurance that the specific purpose of an act one may have chosen to perform was the only plausible alternative for one's own specific reasons for acting. Without self-confidence, one would have been incapable of fulfilling one of the most important aspects of the teachings, the capacity to claim knowledge as power. To become a man of knowledge was an unceasing process. Being a man of knowledge was not a condition entailing permanency. There was never the certainty that, by carrying out the predetermined steps of the knowledge being taught, one would become a man of knowledge. It was implicit that the function of the steps was only to show how to become a man of knowledge. Thus, becoming a man of knowledge was a task that could not be fully achieved, rather, it was an unceasing process comprising, 1. The idea that one had to renew the quest of becoming a man of knowledge, 2. The idea of one's impermanency, and 3. The idea that one had to follow the path with heart. The constant renewal of the quest of becoming a man of knowledge was expressed in the theme of the four symbolic enemies encountered on the path of learning: fear, clarity, power, and old age. Renewing the quest implied the gaining and the maintenance of control over oneself. A true man of knowledge was expected to battle each of the four enemies, in succession, until the last moment of his life, in order to keep himself actively engaged in becoming a man of knowledge. Yet, despite the truthful renewal of the quest, the odds were inevitably against man. He would succumb to his last symbolic enemy. This was the idea of impermanency. Offsetting the negative value of one's impermanency was the notion that one had to follow the path with heart. The path with heart was a metaphorical way of asserting that in spite of being impermanent, one still had to proceed and had to be capable of finding satisfaction and personal fulfillment in the act of choosing the most amenable alternative and identifying oneself completely with it. Don Juan synthesized the rationale of his whole knowledge in the metaphor that the important thing for him was to find a path with heart and then travel its length, meaning that the identification with the amenable alternative was enough for him. The journey by itself was sufficient. Any hope of arriving at a permanent position was outside the boundaries of his knowledge.